Greetings, fellow detectives. Wizard Kitten here, bringing you a new Nancy Drew analysis video. Today's video is brought to you by the patrons over at Mystique Manor and by all the official Fellow Detective channel members. If you too would like to support the channel and gain access to exclusive features, check out patreon.com/wizardkitten to become a patron, or click join next to the subscribe button to become an official fellow detective. Our favorite heroine, Nancy Drew, typically finds out about mysteries in one of two ways. She's on vacation and stumbles across something mysterious, or she gets hired to solve a case by an involved party. Today we're going to talk about this second scenario, where someone hires Nancy to solve their problems. You'd think that since they've hired Nancy to take the case, that these bosses would be grateful for her expertise and supportive of her endeavors, but this is not always the case. While some of Nancy's bosses are really positive, others are literally evil. So, let's discuss. Today we're going to rank Nancy's bosses on a tier list scale of actively antagonistic to actually supportive. Please be aware that we will be discussing plot spoilers, including culprit spoilers, throughout the Nancy Drew series. You have been warned. So first, who gets to be included as part of this ranking? I'm only counting bosses that hire Nancy in an official capacity, paid or unpaid, not situations where Nancy volunteers to help someone out in more of an unofficial friendly capacity. For example, Rose Green in Message in a Haunted Mansion and Bette and Ed Raleigh might own the location that Nancy is at and give her permission to exist as a detective, but Nancy sort of just volunteers to do detective work for them without being asked, so I can't really call them bosses. Second, the boss needs to be the person who hired Nancy for the case or job. Managers in this case would not be considered bosses. For example, Joanna Riggs is Nancy's manager in Secret of the Scarlet Hand and gives her jobs and tasks to complete, but Nancy ultimately reports to Franklin Rose and is hired to solve the mystery by Franklin Rose. Third, a boss can be considered the person who hires Nancy for a job or internship, even if they didn't know that a mystery was going to happen. For example, Quigley Kim is Nancy's boss in Creature of Kapu Cave because she hired her as an entomology intern, and Nancy completes this job simultaneously to solving the case that arises. With this criteria in mind, we have 18 bosses from across the series to rank into 5 separate categories. Let's start at the bottom with the most fun category: actively antagonistic bosses. These bosses may or may not start out with ill intent, but at some point in the mystery, they try to kill or harm Nancy. Perhaps unsurprisingly, all 4 of the bosses who end up in this category also end up being culprits. First, we have Detective Beach from Secrets Can Kill Remastered. He hires Nancy under false pretenses, hoping that she'll find Jake's journal, which implicates him as the person who killed Jake. Nancy ultimately figures this out, pushing Detective Beach to pull a weapon on her and threaten her life. Next, Laurie Gerard in Last Train to Blue Moon Canyon invites the Hardy Boys, and hence Nancy, and multiple other guests to see which of them can solve the mystery of Jake Hurley's train. Nancy manages to figure everything out and find the hidden treasure that Laurie was actually after. And then her lust for fame, fortune, and respect compels her to attempt to try and trap Nancy in an abandoned mine by causing a minor avalanche of stone. Third, Minette from Danger by Design isn't technically the person who hired Nancy for the case, but we never have any contact with our actual boss, and Minette acts enough like a boss that I'm going to count her. Minette is a truly atrocious boss from the get-go, throwing objects at employees, screaming at them, arguing with them about mundane tasks, and completely ignoring their needs. But the kicker is at the end of the mystery, when Nancy overhears Minette's evil plan and is then forced to fight Minette Ichido style. Thank goodness Nancy has fought so many imaginary elves before. Finally, Victor Lawsett from The Deadly Device hires Nancy based on Deirdre's awful recommendation, thinking that Nancy will be horrible at her job and hoping that she will fail. That's already a horrible boss move, but then he knocks Nancy unconscious multiple times and tries to electrocute her to death in a faulty Faraday cage. Yeesh. So yeah, needless to say, these 4 bosses are easily the worst in the series. If your boss tries to kill you, I'm gonna go ahead and say that they're probably not the best employer. Next up the scale, we have 4 unreasonable bosses. These bosses are those that make really weird, annoying, and sometimes illegal requests of Nancy, and or those who deliver way too harsh of consequences for mistakes. First up, Paula Santos from the Haunted Carousel. There are multiple second chances in this mystery where Nancy is physically harmed through no fault of her own, and Paula is absolutely merciless. Fall off the carousel, get a concussion, and end up in the hospital? Geez, Nancy, you are so irresponsible. You are off the case. I mean, yikes, Paula, don't you think you're being a little harsh? Next, Quigley Kim from Creature of Kapu Cave. Quigley mostly ignores Nancy and or berates her for doing tasks incorrectly. She also is not a strong communicator and blames Nancy for miscommunications that happen, and asks her to break into illegal research facilities. Like, do it yourself, Quigley, come on. Next, Chantal Mwikwe in White Wolf of Icicle Creek. It's one thing to hire a detective and not pay them, but Chantal also makes Nancy work as her cook and maid and doesn't even pay her for those jobs. She also makes Nancy do Tino Balducci's stupid survey because she has a crush on him. Not cool, Chantal. Finally, Sunny June from the Shattered Medallion. I'm counting him as the boss because he directly orchestrates Nancy's appearance on Pacific Run and makes her and several of the other characters do random tasks for him. He endangers people, he forces people to complete weird puzzles and tasks, and he never fully explains himself. Words can't express how annoyed I would be with a boss like Sunny June. So while these bosses might not be out to get Nancy, they aren't exactly kind, thoughtful, or supportive. More often than not, they're harsh, confusing, or ridiculous. Moving up the scale again in the middle, we have dishonest or withholding bosses. These are bosses who hire Nancy for the case, but then lie or withhold crucial information from her, not exactly helping to create a positive or trusting relationship. They aren't antagonistic or unreasonable, but they also aren't making Nancy's job as a detective any easier. First up, Savannah Woodham in Ghost of Thornton Hall. Savannah was supposed to go help solve this case, but she hands it off to Nancy since she's a supernatural skeptic. Savannah, however, neglects to mention her complicated history with the Thornton family, Wade in particular, and leaves out a lot of detail about the seriousness of Charlotte's ghost. She might refer us for this case, but she's not as helpful as she should be. Next, Melina Rossi from Labyrinth of Lies. Melina is pretty helpful for most of the mystery, but after she starts getting threats from Thanos and his organization, she starts withholding information from Nancy, becomes extremely vague, and refuses to help. She eventually says that she's trying to protect Nancy, but she's honestly endangering her by refusing to give her the complete picture. Finally, Dagny Silva from Sea of Darkness. Dagny brings us in to find Magnus and hopefully the treasure of the Hurlykide. She's pretty helpful and trusting for a good portion of the mystery, but partway through, she orchestrates her own disappearance and frames Gunnar, drastically slowing Nancy down and creating a huge rift in their partnership. Not cool, Dagny. So while these bosses aren't the worst, they also aren't the best, which is why they end up right in the middle. Moving on to the second level from the top, we have the mostly absent bosses. These are the bosses that basically don't do anything and just let Nancy do her thing. They don't try to maim her, they aren't unreasonable, they don't lie to her, they basically just ignore her. There are only 2 of these bosses in the series. First, the unnamed headmistress from Warnings at Waverly Academy. We know the headmistress hired Nancy to solve the case of the Black Cat, but she doesn't want to arouse suspicion by having a random transfer student always coming to see her. As such, she treats Nancy as any other student, and basically has no contact with her whatsoever. Perhaps not an inspiring or supportive boss, but at least she doesn't interfere in any way. And lastly, PG Krollmeister from Trail of the Twister. There is only one required call with Krollmeister in the game where he requests updates. You can call him more frequently than that, but otherwise Krollmeister basically leaves Nancy alone. He doesn't interfere with Nancy's progress and only bothers her once, leaving the case in her capable hands. These bosses aren't the best because they aren't actively helpful. But when some of your boss options are actively harmful, an absent boss is definitely a preferable alternative. But finally, at the top of the scale, we have the supportive bosses. These bosses are actually good bosses, supporting Nancy, providing useful information, staying transparent, demonstrating concern for her safety, and holding her to reasonable expectations. Luckily for Nancy, this is also the largest category, though not by much, with 5 bosses total. First up, Franklin Rose from Secret of the Scarlet Hand. Franklin vouches for Nancy every step of the way, entirely confident in her abilities. He cheers her on, is willing to compromise with Nancy in order to do what's right, and keeps everything reasonable. He even writes her a letter of recommendation for an internship later in the series, which is really thoughtful. Next, Mrs. Petrov from Curse of Blackmore Manor. Mrs. Petrov is deeply concerned about her daughter, Linda Penvelin, and is definitely on edge from worry, but she's also reasonable and trusts Nancy to find answers. She does get skeptical of Nancy's priorities at times, but given the stress she's under, she does a solid job of keeping her fears balanced. Next, Sophia Leperace from Phantom of Venice. Sophia is Nancy's contact with the GDIF, and she does a fantastic job. She's a clear, thorough, and kind communicator who reassures Nancy and encourages her to take on challenges. She supports Nancy where she can, but also trusts Nancy to work independently. It's a great partnership and a fantastic representation of what a good boss should be. Next, Marcus Boehm from The Captive Curse. Now, Marcus can get a little sassy at times, but when it comes down to it, he doesn't hide things from Nancy, and he trusts her with an exceedingly complicated mission. Despite the grave nature of the monster situation, Marcus really doesn't seem all that concerned, an indication that he is not worried about Nancy's competence. He is also completely reasonable, as evidenced by how he speaks about Anya despite their complicated relationship. All in all, a great boss. And finally, Dr. John Boyle from Tomb of the Lost Queen. Dr. Boyle is only physically around for a brief portion of the game, but whether in person or over the phone, Dr. Boyle is clear, thoughtful, and respectful of Nancy and her skills. He trusts Nancy in a dangerous situation and makes clear that her safety is a priority to him. Especially when compared to the other leader on site, Dr. Boyle stands out as an excellent boss. It is nice to see that Nancy does at least have a handful of positive boss experiences throughout the series, several bosses who support her, listen to her, and trust in her abilities. So, what conclusions can we draw from this analysis? Well, first, in a mystery, you can't ever really trust that the person who hired you isn't to blame for the crime. In Nancy's experience, there's a 22% chance that the person who hired her will try to kill her. While this is unlikely to be the ratio in real life, in mysteries, one must always exercise caution. We can also conclude that Nancy has about a 50-50 chance of working for someone that isn't horrible, which isn't a fantastic ratio. This could be because people already have their hackles raised in a mystery situation due to all of the crimes being committed, or it could just be that Nancy's unlucky. Who knows, maybe Deirdre has given more than one recommendation in her time. Finally, if I was forced to choose, I would say that Victor Lossett is the worst boss of the series, and Sophia Leperace is the best. But what do you think, fellow detectives? Which boss from the Nancy Drew series is the best, and which is the worst? Do you agree with how I ranked the other bosses? Are there any bosses that I forgot that should have been included? Let a Wizard Kitten know in the comment section down below. If you really enjoyed this video, please consider hitting that like button or tipping me for the video with a super thanks next to the download button right beneath the video. If you would like to come join a fantastic group of fellow detectives at Mystique Manor as a patron for the channel, gain access to exclusive content, and support the making of more content like this, please check out patreon.com/wizardkitten. I also have channel memberships with exclusive badges and emojis to use during streams and in the comment section. If you'd like to support the channel by becoming an official fellow detective, click join next to the subscribe button. Please feel free to follow the channel on Instagram or Discord, linked in the description box down below. And as always, please feel free to like, comment, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more Nancy Drew and Sims 4 content. Thank you so much for watching, fellow detectives. I will see you soon.